Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is When Kafka Met Freud, The Judgment of Psychology. I think one ought to read nothing but books that bite and sting. If the book we are reading does not wake us up with the blow of a fist against the skull, then why are we reading that book? So that it will make us happy? My God, we would be happy even if we had no books. And in a pinch, we could write such books as make us happy ourselves. No, we need those books that affect us like a misfortune, that cause us a lot of pain, like the death of someone we have loved better than ourselves, as if we were cast out in the forests, cut off from all human beings, like a suicide. A book must be the axe for the frozen sea in us. Letter to Oscar Pollock, 1904. Miserable, by Josef Capek. Poems from a concentration camp. I was there in body, but in spirit with all of you. In every thought, I was only with you. I saw only you, and not what was going on there. My soul was here, only my body was there. How happy I am again, here among all of you. That is to say, in truth, is it me? Oh yes, it is me. Only my body stayed behind, there in the foreign land. My body was taken by the foreign land. Well, hi everybody, and this is the continuation of a series on Kafka. So I hope you're not suffering from Kafka fatigue, but don't worry, there's more to come, more punishment. But the idea is I've already done a live stream with Richard Grannon on Metamorphosis, and we mentioned in that, and I've already asked viewers to try and have a look at the short story, The Judgment. So I wanted to do at least this video and maybe more to go into depth, because I wanted to concentrate on the actual text today, make sure that everyone's familiar with it, and then maybe go deeper and deeper and deeper. So there'll be this one, and then there'll be probably two, maybe more videos on the Metamorphosis to pursue some of the themes that were discussed in the live stream. So I know it's a lot of Kafka, but I just think he's such an incredible author and relevant to many of the themes that this channel's based upon. And in this particular video, I want to ask you to think of the story The Judgment in the light of Freud, because I'm not claiming, just to emphasize from the get-go, I'm not claiming the only interpretation of the short story The Judgment should be a Freudian one. But I do think for those that struggle with the meaning of the story, it can be a helpful yardstick or guideline or whatever odd directional metaphor I want to use, or I'm trying to use. But as you can see from that list, that's how the short story by Kafka is placed within the various publications. There's a random selection there, but just to give you a sense of the chronology. And I know for a fact that Kafka was familiar with Freud's work, because Freud was very popular at the time, especially the first one there, The Interpretation of Dreams, it was quite notorious in Middle European circles. But I think it was The Psychopathology of Everyday Life that he read in a reading group not that long, the same year that he wrote the short story The Judgment. And later you can see there, 1913, Totem and Taboo is maybe future video on that, but it's brilliant work by Freud. Mad as a box of frogs in some sense, because he just completely speculates about the origins of human society based upon the idea that the head chief needs to be killed by the sons or the people below him. So there's this, it leads into a lot of theorizing about the nature of fatherhood or leadership, which has obvious relevance to the short story The Judgment. And then 1923 there, The Ego and the Id. What I'm going to suggest is that in The Judgment, in some senses, Kafka was ahead of the game. He foresaw some of the development of the theory of the ego, the id, and the superego, and it's present in the story, the judgment. And just a final mention of the go back to the interpretation of dreams. We'll see at the beginning of the story the phrase, George is in a dreamlike state. The metamorphosis begins with a dream. Or he's just woken up, Gregor Samsa. And then I'm thinking in the trial, he's just woken up when the police come to call for him. There's a dreamy atmosphere to the castle. It's a very common theme in Kafka, and it begs the question, to what extent are the content of his stories straightforward stories, or to what extent are they imagined by the characters? So it's like a fiction within a fiction, a metafiction. You have fictional characters having dreams themselves, which just complicates the layers of meaning. But this is what I used for the thumbnail. It's called The Three Judges, 1858 to 60, by Honoré Daumier, and I just like, it's something I'll maybe explore again in future, but watercolours. There's something you can do with watercolours. The blurriness, I find, and I'm pretty positive that's a watercolour. If that turns out to be some charcoal creation and I'm just making things up, I apologise. But irrespective, you get my point about watercolours. There's this blurring effect, and with charcoal as well to a lesser extent, the lack of the clarity of the brushstrokes, etc., you can impute quite a bit of meaning. So the faces of the judges to either side of the main judge are not very well defined, but I think that actually adds something to the picture. And then I wanted to get these not out the way, but show you, this is another image called The Great Judge by James Ensor from 1898. So you can see the scales of justice in his hand. So these are just two images that I find interesting because they relate to the issue of judgment. And then all the other images I'm going to show you today are from Josef Capek, who was a contemporary and a compatriot of Kafka's. He wasn't Jewish as far as I know, but he ended up, it's a tragic story, he ended up in the death camps. So he died tragically in 1945. They never found his body, but they estimate he died on, I think it was April 30th, 1945, which wasn't long before the death camp he was in, Bergen-Belsen, was liberated. And just as a piece of trivia, his brother was called Karel Čapek, and he wrote a play, RUR, which stands for Rossum's Universal Robots. And Karel Čapek said that it was Josef here, this artist that we're going to look at today, who gave him the word robot, which then subsequently entered the English language. And I think that play was first performed in 1920. But there's something, I'm just so, as I've mentioned before, there's a particular person who's given me a traumatic injury by saying that my voice sounds like a Mardi Ringo Starr. So I don't like to read out all the way through these talks. I always try and intersperse as far as possible pieces of text with images. So all the interspersed images are by this artist from now on. And just to give you a little example, I don't know what it is, but there's I'm not really normally into cubism, or I like expressionism. He's on the border of a few artistic movements, arguably, but he had his own unique form of Czech cubism, which I don't know, maybe that's what I see in the mirror, but it speaks to me in some shape or form. So without more ado, let's dive into the actual short story. It was a Sunday morning in the very height of spring. George Benderman, a young merchant, was sitting in his own room on the first floor of one of a long row of small, ramshackle houses stretching beside the river, which was scarcely distinguishable from each other in height and colouring. He had just finished a letter to an old friend of his who was now living abroad, had put it into its envelope in a slow and dreamy fashion, and with his elbows propped on the writing table, was gazing out of the window at the river, the bridge, and the hills on the farther bank with their tender green. Now, the letter writing here, I think, is important just to emphasize. What I'm going to do is just give you relatively brief comments, and like I say, hopefully, if there hasn't been a complete mutiny on the channel and you're still prepared to watch something about Kafka, I'll go into this in a lot more depth. But just to, and it'll take forever to get through the whole story if I do long, rambling comments like I am now. So, to make it very brief, the letter writing, Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, had this phrase, a letter always arrives at its destination. And in a typically elusive and allusive French writer's style, what he was implying was that in reality, a letter may be sent but never received by the intended recipient. It could be lost in the post, it could be destroyed, whatever. But in the symbolic realm, the person who wrote the letter has got something out of their system, and in that sense, the letter arrives at its destination, which is one very quick explanation of what he's on about. I don't think it's quite that simple. And I've had a bit of pushback when we looked at his letter to his father by Kafka to his father Herman, and I wasn't particularly sympathetic to all the moaning that Kafka did to his poor old dad. But this theme about his father and his mother is written about in this story, but I think psychologically some of the issues raised are very relevant to Kafka, but he's also played with the actual factual truth, because he didn't, in this letter, he's active in the business. Interestingly, in Kafka's own life, he tried to distance himself from his father's business as much as possible. And his father was had a fancy goods store, and I think he diversified, and later on in life ran an asbestos factory of all things. And there was a lot of pressure for Franz to get involved in the family business, which he fought against. So in some ways, this story is a bit of weird wish fulfillment. It's about what he could have been, his alter ego, and that's an important notion, his alter ego, because I'm going to argue as we go along that the friend he's writing to, an old friend of his who is now living abroad, I'd suggest he doesn't actually exist in reality. That's a figment of George's imagination, or it's his alter ego, and I'll explore that as we go along. But I just think the next, I won't comment on the images as you see them, but I just think the next one's a beautiful illustration of this quote. He was thinking about his friend who had actually run away to Russia some years before, being dissatisfied with his prospects at home. Now he was carrying on a business in St. Petersburg, which had flourished to begin with, but had long been going downhill, as he always complained on his increasingly rare visits. So he was wearing himself out to no purpose in a foreign country. The unfamiliar full beard he wore did not quite conceal the face George had known so well since childhood, and his skin was growing so yellow as to indicate some latent disease. To quick comment on this, the business of writing, the business in St. Petersburg, you could interpret that as a coded reference to the business of Kafka's writing. And he has to go off to a foreign land to do that writing because it's a place in his mind that's quite distant from his own family. And his skin was growing so yellow as to indicate some latent disease. As we'll go along, and I am fully aware that psychoanalysis can always be accused of being perverted and seeing deviancy everywhere, or sex everywhere in particular. But there are various scholars who suggest that this notion of a latent disease, when it's physical manifestation like this, his skin is almost like jaundiced, skin was growing so yellow. One of the suggestions is that latent disease in Kafka's work could refer possibly to suggestions that Kafka may have been a repressed homosexual, because issues arise in his writing guilt and shame all the time. So the argument or the suggestion is that he has some weird, either weird sexual deviancy that he never acts on, or he was just a straightforward gay person who, in that time, this was obviously a huge social deal and would have brought great shame upon his family. So he internalized that feeling of guilt potentially. Or, this is what we don't know because there's relatively little concrete evidence. There's one reference in his diary where he makes a homoerotic comment, but there's the implication that he had 3 failed engagements. But then again, towards the end of his life, he lived with a woman called Dora, and that all seemed to go tickety-boo. But he had a long life of failed relationships with women, and he went to prostitutes early in his life, and I think he wrote about how he found that quite disgusting. But then there's the alternative suggestion it was actually more about he was married to his work, so that was the constant tension. So it could all be a massive red herring of Moby Dick-sized proportions, so to speak. By his own account, he had no regular connection with the colony of his fellow countrymen out there, and almost no social intercourse with Russian families, so that he was resigning himself to becoming a permanent bachelor. So you can see why people have read something into this concept of a permanent bachelor. But also remember that social intercourse, the word business, intercourse, and traffic all have synonymous meanings in German, apparently, and it's very relevant to the final sentence of the whole story when we get to it. Du, du, du. What could one write to such a man who had obviously run off the rails? A man one could be sorry for but could not help. Should one advise him to come home, to transplant himself and take up his old friendships again? There was nothing to hinder him, and in general to rely upon the help of his friends. But that was as good as telling him, and the more kindly the more offensively, that all his efforts hitherto had miscarried, that he should finally give up, come back home, and be gaped at by everyone as a returned prodigal, that only his friends knew what was what, and that he himself was just a big child who should do what his successful and home-keeping friends prescribed. And was it certain, besides, that all the pain one would have to inflict on him would achieve its object? So there's a major theme there of loneliness and isolation that is evident in the story, the metamorphosis as well as this. And the end of the trial, plot spoiler, but he gets carted off to an isolated quarry to be killed, executed. And one of the final things he sees is a face in a window, and it races through his head: is this person reaching out to help? Are they concerned about me? But that just almost emphasizes how lonely he is. And there's the issue of this idea of bringing him home. Is this bringing him away from his sexual peccadillos or what doesn't fit in with society at large, or is it about bringing him back from the land where he writes that, again, doesn't really fit with family expectations and society? It's, it can be interpreted either way, I suppose. Supposing one wanted to keep up correspondence with him, one could not send him any real news, such as could frankly be told to the most distant acquaintance. It was more than 3 years since his last visit, and for this he offered the lame excuse that the political situation in Russia was too uncertain, which apparently would not permit even the briefest absence of a small businessman, while it allowed hundreds of thousands of Russians to travel peacefully abroad. So I think this is significant because it's about what we may tell ourselves. If George is writing to his alter ego, he's basically saying his alter ego is giving him an excuse for not coming home. So it's about, in Freudian terms, how the correspondence between the ego, which I'd suggest is George, and his unconscious, his id, the, his friend, the businessman in St. Petersburg. In Freudian theory, the ego doesn't correspond directly with the id. Everything gets filtered through the superego, which we'll come to explore in terms of George's father. So remember, this is before Freud's theory about the ego was fully developed, but arguably it's implicit in this story. And he's basically saying that the excuse that as a small businessman he couldn't travel, he doesn't buy it. So I'd argue this is a metaphor for how internally and externally the notion of correspondence and talking and the excuses we give ourselves and others, there's never a direct correspondence, so to speak, between the truth and what we really feel. It's a complex mess and mesh of conflicting emotions and half-truths, and the question of full truth we'll come to later on. Again, But during these 3 years, George's own position in life had changed a lot. 2 years ago, his mother had died, since when he and his father had shared the household together. And his friend had, of course, been informed of that and had expressed his sympathy in a letter phrased so dryly that the grief caused by such an event, one had to conclude, could not be realised in a distant country. Since that time, however, George had applied himself with greater determination to the business as well as to everything else. So I mentioned earlier, in real life, Franz Kafka did not apply himself to the business. He only wanted to write. And he had a job in a workers' accident insurance type. It was a semi-governmental organisation of which he was a lawyer and very good at his job apparently, but he wanted to write deep into the night and work as little as possible so that he could actually do his true work, which was his writing. And it's just fascinating because he lived, as in his professional life, looking at quite bureaucratic, boring stuff about workers' safety. So that actually gave him some unique insights into the bureaucracies he wrote about in his fiction. But in this particular example of the distance between the question of empathy, it could be referring to the way in which in the land of Russia, which he's using as a metaphor for where he has to go distantly to write, you have to distance yourself from everyday concerns and normal human empathy and sympathy in order to devote yourself to your writing is potentially one reading, this emotional detachment required to write effectively. But George's friend had no inkling of this improvement. In earlier years, perhaps for the last time in that letter of condolence, he had tried to persuade George to emigrate to Russia and had enlarged upon the prospects of success for precisely George's branch of trade. The figures quoted were microscopic by comparison with the range of George's present operations, yet he shrank from letting his friend know about his business success, as if he were to do it now retrospectively, that would certainly look peculiar. And that's just, again, it intimates or implies this way in which if, and it's a big if, and I'm not saying that the Freudian model fits perfectly at all, but if you think of the friend in St. Petersburg as his alter ego, or his id, or his unconscious, again, it's the way in which he shrank from letting his friend, in other words, this communication between the two parts of his psyche, things are repressed, which is classic Freudian theory. So George confined himself to giving his friend unimportant items of gossip, such as rise at random in the memory when one is idly thinking things over on a quiet Sunday. All he desired was to leave undisturbed the idea of the hometown, which his friend must have built up to his own content during the long interval. And that alludes to, I'm resisting the temptation just to start wittering on endlessly about Proust and La Recherche Pompidou and involuntary memory and the memories we create, nostalgic, idealised memories. And that's interesting, the way in which your ego and your more residual, repressed, not even repressed, but just submerged, the memories you'd like to have, or the the fake nostalgia, or it's a human proclivity to look to the past with rose-tinted spectacles sometimes. You can go either way. You can look at the past with horror, or you can look at the past and filter out, the bad aspects. And sometimes it's amusing if you talk with family members about your memory of a particular event, and you might have thought it was great and fun, and it was one of the great traumas of their life. So there's, our minds play funny tricks with memories and our experiences of the past. And let's just leave it at that for now. If brevity is the soul of wit, that's a very funny title to a painting. And so it happened to George that 3 times in 3 fairly widely separated letters he had told his friend about the engagement of an unimportant man to an equally unimportant girl, until indeed, quite contrary to his intentions, his friend began to show some interest in this notable event. Yet George preferred to write about things like these rather than to confess that he himself had got engaged a month ago to a Fräulein Frieda Brandenfeld, a girl from a well-to-do family. And there's 2 things there. One is the number 3, which in future I want to explore because Kafka knew about the Judaic tradition of the Kabbalah, and the number 3 is quite a key mystical number. It appears in Metamorphosis many times, which I'm going to go into in depth. But also Frieda Brandenfeld is his real life twice failed fiance was Felice Bauer. And I think in letters to Felice he actually mentions, or in his diaries, FB here. It's the same. He's making an obvious reference to his real life. And this is I don't know why, this is one of my favourite. I think I do know why, because there's a dark cloud at the top. And this is suggesting all paths of life. And interestingly, in the bottom left-hand corner, 33, the number 3 again. But it's the message to me in this, because you know what a cheery soul I am. We're all heading. And the way the path in the top corner to the dark cloud, the eaves of the roof of the building make it look like an arrow. So whether old or young, we're all on the path to a dark cloud of oblivion. That's my interpretation of that painting, which it's like a hybrid between, if you ask me, Van Gogh's later work, the thickness of the paint, and Edvard Munch. Again, some of his titles are complex Czech phrases that I will not try to pronounce, but sometimes this is the English translation. This wouldn't have been the original, obviously. But I just like cloud. Doesn't mess about. He often discussed this friend of his with his fiancée and the peculiar relationship that had developed between them in their correspondence. "So he won't be coming to our wedding," said she, "and yet I have a right to get to know all your friends." "I don't want to trouble him," answered George. "Don't misunderstand me. He would probably come, at least I think so, but he would feel that his hand had been forced and he would be hurt. Perhaps he would envy me, and certainly he'd be discontented, and without being able to do anything about his discontent, he'd have to go away again alone." "Alone? Do you know what that means?" "Yes, but may you not hear about our wedding in some other fashion? I can't prevent that, of course, but it's unlikely considering the way he lives." Again, I won't dwell on it, but the implication, if you want to take repressed homosexuality as a theme, I think it's implicit in this discussion. But again, simultaneously, is it about him being married to his work? But again, it's about him being unwilling to talk to his alter ego, his other self. "Since your friends are like that, George, you shouldn't ever have got engaged at all." "Well, we're both to blame for that, but I wouldn't have it any other way." now. And when breathing quickly under his kisses, she still brought out, "All the same, I do feel upset." He thought it could not really involve him in trouble, were he to send the news to his friend. "That's the kind of man I am, and he'll just have to take me as I am," he said to himself. "I can't cut myself to another pattern that might be a more suitable friend for him." So this notion of internal, I read that very badly, apologies, but this internal correspondence within your own psyche is quite interesting. The notion of what is our true identity to ourselves. Do we even know to ourselves what our true identity is? At last he put the letter in his pocket and went out of his room across a small lobby into his father's room, which he had not entered for months. There was in fact no need for him to enter it, since he saw his father daily at business, and they took their midday meal together at an eating house. In the evening, it was true, each did as he pleased, yet even then, unless George, as mostly happened, went out with his friends or more recently visited his fiancée, they always sat for a while, each with his newspaper, in their common sitting room. Just to observe here that there are various scholars make the link between the darkness of his father's room and Kafka's relationship to his Jewish, Judaic, Talmudic heritage. So the idea of the dark father's room as the dark interior of a synagogue, and that's been developed in quite some depth, because he was not he was culturally Jewish, but he did not feel religiously Jewish in any way, except towards the end of his life he started learning Hebrew and he took more interest in his Jewish heritage. And irrespective of whether he didn't feel particularly Jewish, I think there's a massively Jewish theological tone to a lot of his writing that scholars have picked up on. So Gershom Scholem was a Kabbalah scholar who championed Kafka's work and argued that there was this almost mystical Jewish element to it, pseudo-theological. So God's not present in Kafka's work, but he's almost present through his absence, if that makes sense. I think the strand of literature referred to is apophatic literature, which engages with notions of God by describing basically how we can't describe God. So it's like a negative theology, what we know of God from what we can't say of God, which is, again, at a future date, I could spend hours talking about that. It surprised George how dark his father's room was, even on this sunny morning. He had not remembered that it was so overshadowed by the high wall on the other side of the narrow courtyard. His father was sitting by the window in a corner hung with various mementos of George's dead mother, reading a newspaper which he held to one side before his eyes in an attempt to overcome a defect of vision. On the table stood the remains of his breakfast, not much of which seemed to have been eaten. So an interesting aspect of this is the what's the phrase there? Defect of vision. His father squinting at the newspaper, which could be seen as an allusion to how in family dynamics we all squint at our relationships to each other. We don't have a proper view. There's always a defect in our vision, and that's just the nature of families. George, said his father, rising at once to meet him. His heavy dressing gown swung open as he walked, and the skirts of it fluttered around him. My father is still a giant of a man, said George to himself. And again, family dynamics. You're entering the realm where George is becoming the parent and his father is becoming the child. But even in those situations, the complex changing of the guard, so to speak, there's always this sense that the father figure is this huge figure, even if physically they no longer are. It's unbearably dark here, he said aloud. Yes, it's dark enough, answered his father. And you've shut the window too? I prefer it like that. Well, it's quite warm outside, said George, as if continuing his previous remark, and sat down. His father cleared away the breakfast dishes and set them on a chest. I really only wanted to tell you, went on George, who had been vacantly following the old man's movements, that I am now sending the news of my engagement to St. Petersburg. He drew the letter a little way from his pocket and let it drop back again. To St. Petersburg? Asked his father. To my friend there, said George, trying to meet his father's eye. In business hours he's quite different, he was thinking, how solidly he sits there with his arms crossed. So letting the letter drop back in his pocket, there's pockets will come up again shortly, but it's almost a reflex reaction. He draws the letter and then lets it drop back, alluding to the way in which we almost say things but never quite do, perhaps. Oh yes, to your friend, said his father with peculiar emphasis. So we're introducing the notion of doubt. His father thinks he's full of it. Well, you know, father, that I wanted not to tell him about my engagement at first. Out of consideration for him, that was the only reason. You know yourself he's a difficult man. I said to myself that someone else might tell him about my engagement, although he's such a solitary creature that he was hardly likely. That was hardly likely. I couldn't prevent that, but I wasn't ever going to tell him myself. And now you've changed your mind? Asked his father, laying his enormous newspaper on the window-sill, and on top of it his spectacles, which he covered with one hand. Yes, I've been thinking it over. If he's a good friend of mine, I said to myself, my being happily engaged should make him happy too, and so I wouldn't put off telling him any longer. But before I posted the letter, I wanted you to know. It's interesting also, this is a very minor point, but the enormous newspaper, I think in Metamorphosis, his father's always reading the newspaper. And maybe there is something about fathers that are either reading the newspaper or as a child, or you wonder sometimes parents are really interested in the news that you're quite ignorant of. And it's just this little indicative image of the difference between the younger person and the older person, perhaps. And maybe also the newspaper, if someone sat there, they're in the family, but it's almost like a barrier. They hold up the newspaper as this. I just think I'm going off on a newspaper philic rant, but there's something about newspapers in Kafka's work that I will have a think about. You'd be glad to know. George, said his father, lengthening his toothless mouth, listen to me. You've come to me about this business to talk it over with me. No doubt that does you honour, but it's nothing. It's worse than nothing if you don't tell me the whole truth. I don't want to stir up matters that shouldn't be mentioned here. Since the death of our dear mother, certain things have been done that aren't right. Maybe the time will come for mentioning them, and maybe sooner than we think. There's many a thing in the business I'm not aware of. Maybe it's not done behind my back. I'm not going to say that it's done behind my back. I'm not equal to things any longer. My memory's failing. I haven't an eye for so many things any longer. That's the course of nature in the first place. And in the second place, the death of our dear mother hit me harder than it did you. But since we're talking about it, about this letter, I beg you, George, don't deceive me. It's a trivial affair. It's hardly worth mentioning. So don't deceive me. Do you really have this friend in St. Petersburg? And this is where, if you think of the father as the superego, the superego has various aspects. It's this wheedling voice often in our heads, and it somewhat mediates between the ego and the id. It acts as a filtering device, but also another aspect of it is that it can never be satisfied. It's the thing that in the middle of the night that tells you you're worthless. I'm not sharing. I'm not. But it's the thing that no matter how, for example, I'm definitely not talking about me now, but if you imagine an incredibly successful person, it's the thing that makes the billionaire go for their next billion because they're still not satisfied, because there's little voice in their head that might have been with them since they're a small child. Their father's voice might be saying, "You're worthless," and they have to keep going. And it's the superego can never be satisfied, is the short version of that, Witter. And he's asking for the what. This is a slightly random reference, but if on Netflix there's a German series called The Dogs of Berlin, it's been out a while. I think it was made in 2018. But in that, plot spoiler, you won't watch it now because I've ruined it for you. But in the very, they only made one series, and I don't think they're doing another one. It's too late now. But in the very final episode, I think it's the 10th episode, lots have gone on. There's a rogue cop. He's been having an affair, but his wife also has an affair near the end of the series. And she takes him into her office and sits him down and basically says, "This is what I've done. Now, from you, I want complete honesty." And I don't speak German. I know it's obviously subtitles are on. I don't know the exact phrase, but that's the essence of what she says. "I want complete honesty from you now." And there is a real duh moment because that's how the whole thing ends, which is wonderful because if they'd have made a second series, I think they would have just ruined that cliffhanger. This rogue person who's done absolutely loads of wrong things. The implication is, where does he even begin to tell the truth? And as a reference to all of us, it's a theme that's been explored. Ricky Gervais did a whole film on the notion of what if you didn't lie at all. So an interesting aspect of human existence is we need to lie because you can't handle the truth, to quote Jack Nicholson in A Few Good Men, I think that was. It's the idea that no, institution, society, and family dynamics are all held together by us not telling the truth sometimes. So that's quite an interesting aspect of it. George rose in embarrassment. "Never mind my friends. 1,000 friends wouldn't make up to me for my father. Do you know what I think? You're not taking enough care of yourself. But old age must be taken care of. I can't do without you in the business, you know that very well. But if the business is going to undermine your health, I'm ready to close it down tomorrow forever. And that won't do. We'll have to make a change in your way of living, but a radical change. You sit here in the dark, and in the sitting room you would have plenty of light. You just take a bite of breakfast instead of properly keeping up your strength. You sit by a closed window, and the air would be so good for you. No, father, I'll get the doctor to come, and we'll follow his orders. We'll change your room. You can move into that front room, and I'll move in here. You won't notice the change. All of your things will be moved with you. But there's time for that later. I'll put you to bed now for a little. I'm sure you need to rest." So this is what we're saying about the reversal of carer, parent, child, but also in these scenarios, there's the perennial dynamic whereby the older person who's been in charge all their life struggles to deal with the changing dynamic, and that can create lots of tension. George stood close beside his father, who had let his head, with its unkempt white hair, that sounds familiar, sink on his chest. "George," said his father in a low voice without moving. George knelt down at once beside his father. In the old man's weary face he saw the pupils, overlarge, fixedly looking at him from the corners of the eyes. "You have no friend in St. Petersburg. You've always been a leg puller, and you haven't shrunk from pulling my leg. How could you have a friend out there? I can't believe it." "Just think back a bit, father," said George, lifting his father from the chair and slipping off his dressing gown as he stood feebly enough. "It'll soon be 3 years since my friend came to see us last. I remember that you used to not like him very much. At least twice I kept you from seeing him, although he was actually sitting with me in my room. I could quite well understand your dislike of him. My friend has his peculiarities. But then, later, you got on with him very well. I was proud because you listened to him and nodded and asked him questions. Again, this could be seen as the alter ego, but also representative of George's own relationship with his father. So at times he got on with his father, at other times he didn't, and he's projecting this onto this imaginary friend. If you think back, you're bound to remember. He used to tell us the most incredible stories of the Russian Revolution. For instance, when he was on a business trip to Kiev and he ran into a riot and saw a priest on a balcony who cut a broad cross in blood on the palm of his hand and, held the hand up and appealed to the mob. You've told that story yourself once or twice since. Meanwhile, George had succeeded in lowering his father down again and carefully taking off the woolen drawers he wore over his linen underpants and his socks. The not particularly clean appearance of his underwear made him reproach himself for having been neglectful. So there's the idea there of the dirty underwear as don't wash your dirty linen in public. Arguably, that's a reference to, again, the secrets that underlie family scenarios. And then in the Metamorphosis, there's just a little throwaway line where the mother, when Gregor is indisposed as a beetle, monstrous vermin, she starts sewing underwear as a seamstress. It's mentioned specifically. So it's in more than one piece of work by Kafka, his underwear fixation. He carried his father to the bed in his arms. It gave him a dreadful feeling to notice that while he took the few steps towards the bed, the old man on his breast was playing with his watch chain. He could not lay him down on the bed for a moment, so firmly did he hang on to the watch chain. So there's two issues there about the watch chain. On the one hand, he's acting like a child would, a little infant being held to an adult's chest, would grasp their developing kinetic skills and curious about the world around them. So the father's reverted to this, incredibly young child. On the other hand, there's scholars have pointed out the watch chain could be a reference or is resonant with the notion of chains of families and the idea that potentially George isn't going to, as a permanent bachelor, isn't going to keep the chain of the family going. But as soon as he was laid in bed, all seemed well. He covered himself up and even drew the blankets farther than usual over his shoulders. He looked up at George with a not unfriendly eye. You begin to remember, my friend, don't you? Asked George, giving him an encouraging nod. Am I well covered up now? Asked his father, as if he were not able to see whether his feet were properly tucked in or not. So you find it snug in bed already, said George, and tucked the blankets more closely around him. Am I well covered up? Asked his father once more, seeming to be strangely intent upon the answer. Don't worry, you're well covered up. No, cried his father, cutting short the answer, threw the blankets off with a strength that sent them all flying in a moment, and sprang erect in bed, only one hand lightly touching the ceiling to steady him. So this is a sudden reversal, the father weakening, George taking over the parent's role. But when he said earlier on, my father is still a giant of a man, this is it manifesting itself again. And the being wrapped up in bed, there's the metamorphosis where wanting to stay in bed is a theme. And also there's a short story, Preparations for a Country Wedding, in which this notion of the desire Rabban, I think the protagonist is, wants to stay in bed and send a fully clothed alter ego off to this wedding and out into the world. So it's a recurrent theme in Kafka's work. You wanted to cover me up. I know, my young sprig, but I'm far from being covered up yet. And even if this is the last strength I have, it's enough for you, too much for you. Of course I know your friend. He would have been a son after my own heart. That's why you've been playing him false all these years. Why else? Do you think I haven't been sorry for him? And that's why you had to lock yourself up in your office. The chief is busy, mustn't be disturbed, just so that you could write your lying little letters to Russia. But thank goodness a father doesn't need to be taught how to see through his son. And now that you thought you'd got him down, so far down that you could set your bottom on him and sit on him, and he wouldn't move, then my fine son makes up his mind to get married. So a lot of these themes are all beginning to come together. There's the scarcely veiled homosexual reference in the second paragraph. You could set your bottom on him. And then there's this, it happens to be the father's son, but it could be the mother-daughter. It's this, he would have been a son after my own heart. The expectations of parents and how they interrelate with their offspring. It can be a, dictatorial presence in your psyche, or it can be a liberating, you feel supported. It's an impossible task, I guess, for a parent to ever get it right. If I don't get a haircut soon, that's going to look like me. George stared at the bogey conjured up by his father. His friend in St. Petersburg, whom his father suddenly knew too well, touched his imagination as never before. Lost in the vastness of Russia, he saw him. At the door of an empty, plundered warehouse, he saw him. Among the wreckage of his showcases, the slashed remnants of his wares, the falling gas brackets, he was just standing up. Why did he have to go so far away? So again, if this is his alter ego, seeing himself as his father sees him in the vastness of Russia, an empty, plundered warehouse among the wreckage of his showcases, so arguably fears about his writing and its value, the slashed remnants of his wares. And Kafka was notorious for ripping up work. At the very end, he asked his close friend and editor, Max Brod, to destroy all his work. It was his dying wish that Max Brod completely ignored, luckily for us, and also on the basis, I think I read somewhere someone said if anyone writer asks people to destroy his work on their death, they're full of it, because why don't they just do it themselves, whilst they're still able to? It's one of these things, they don't really want it doing. It's a bit of a performative act. I'm not very sympathetic sometimes to our Franz, even though I think he's an amazing writer. But attend to me, cried his father, and George, almost distracted, ran toward the bed to take everything in, yet came to a stop halfway. Because she lifted up her skirts, his father began to flute. Because she lifted up her skirts like this, the nasty creature. And mimicking her, he lifted his shirt so high that one could see the scar on his thigh from his war wound. Because she lifted her skirts like this, and this made up to her, and in order to make free with her undisturbed, you have disgraced your mother's memory, betrayed your friend, and stuck your father into bed so that he can't move. But he can move, or can't he? And he stood up quite unsupported and kicked his legs out. His insight made him radiant. Just the violence of these, again, family dynamics, the emotion that comes out in arguments. This is quite, the father, this would be shocking to George. The quite salacious detail that's in his father's head, and it seems disproportionate. And these type of thoughts bubbling under the surface in most families, whether they're said or not said. No, hell will freeze over before I try and pronounce that. George shrank into a corner as far away from his father as possible. A long time ago, he had firmly made up his mind to watch closely every least movement so that he should not be surprised by any indirect attack, a pounce from behind or above. At this moment, he recalled this long-forgotten resolve and forgot it again, like a man drawing a short thread through the eye of a needle. But your friend hasn't been betrayed after all, cried his father, emphasising the point with stabs of his forefinger. I've been representing him here on the spot. So in the first paragraph, that got echoes, if you ask me, of Metamorphosis and the bug in the corner, while the rest of his family move about and confront him on occasion. And then after initially having completely denied the existence of his friend, now the complete reversal is he says he's been representing him. Again, the father as the superego, filtering the drives of the id. Stay where you are, I don't need you. You think you have the strength enough to come over here and that you're only hanging back of your own accord. Don't be too sure. I am still much the stronger of us two. All by myself I might have had to give way, but your mother has given me so much of her strength that I've established a fine connection with your friend, and I have your customers here in my pocket. He has pockets even in his shirt, said George to himself, and believed that with this remark he could make him an impossible figure for all the world. Only for a moment did he think so, since he kept on forgetting everything. Just take your bride on your arm and try getting in my way. I'll sweep her from your very side. You don't know how. George made a grimace of disbelief. His father only nodded, confirming the truth of his words, towards George's corner. So having someone in a corner is an obvious... It's literally happened here. Having George in his pocket, and he's even... The idea of having someone in your pocket, having control over them, and there's this pun, because even in a nightshirt, his father has control over him. Even when he's vulnerable, there's still this power that the father has. How you amused me today, coming to ask me if you should tell your friend about your engagement. He knows it already, you stupid boy. He knows it all. I've been writing to him for you to forget to take my writing things. For you forgot to take my writing things away from me. That's why he hasn't been here for years. He knows everything 100 times better than you do yourself. In his left hand he crumples your letters unopened, while in his right hand he holds up my letters to read through. So this would be a classic, the clash between the id and the superego. In his enthusiasm he waved his arm over his head. He knows everything 1,000 times better, he cried. 10,000 times, said George, to make fun of his father, but in his very mouth the words turned into deadly earnest. For years I've been waiting for you to come with such question. Do you think I concern myself with anything else? Do you think I read my newspapers? Look, and he threw George a newspaper sheet which he had somehow taken to bed with him. An old newspaper with a name entirely unknown to George. So this inability, the difference across the generations to communicate. George doesn't even recognise the nature of this newspaper, which I previously said is potentially a barrier, and I think it's been underlined here. And the idea of the letters... This idea, the superego arguably knows you 100 times better than you do yourself. That could be the relationship of the superego to the ego. So you've been lying in wait for me, cried George. His father said pityingly in an offhand manner, I suppose you wanted to say that sooner, but now it doesn't matter. and in a louder voice, "So now you know what else there was in the world besides yourself. Till now you've only known about yourself. An innocent child, yes, that you were, truly. But still more truly have you been a devilish human being. And therefore take note, I sentence you now to death by drowning." George felt himself urged from the room. The crash with which his father fell on the bed behind him was still in his ears as he fled. On the staircase, which he rushed down as if its steps were an inclined plane, he ran into his charwoman on her way up to do the morning cleaning of the room. "Jesus!" she cried, and covered her face with her apron, but he was already gone. Out the front door he rushed, across the roadway, driven toward the water. Already he was grasping at the railings as a starving man clutches food. He swung himself over like the distinguished gymnast he had once been in his youth to his parents' pride. With weakening grip he was still holding on when he spied between the railings a motor bus coming which could easily cover the noise of his fall. Called in a low voice, "Dear parents, I have always loved you, all the same," and let himself drop. At this moment, an unending stream of traffic was just going over the bridge. And I will perhaps, like I say in a subsequent video, explore the notion of traffic, because in German, intercourse, traffic, the unending stream, to say that a perverted Freudian interpretation has been given of that final sentence. Let's have that as a cliffhanger for a potential future truly perverted video about the unending stream of traffic and what it might mean. But just, suffices to say, the psychoanalytical interpretation is of a sexual nature. Dirty, dirty psychoanalysis. I'll just finish with a couple of images now. This is, I think, my favourite of all time, by Capek. And I think it's particularly relevant, the title. So, I know it was kicking off in the 1930s, but it truly kicked off in 1939. So this is just before the eve of the Second World War and all the horrors that brought with it. I just think it's a brilliant representation that takes the cloud, the previous painting, and, puts it on steroids. And then it's just interesting to know that Kafka, the old spelling of that surname is Kavka, which in Czech means jackdaw. So this is a Capek painting that reminded me. And I think it's interesting because there's a mist in the Metamorphosis when he looks out the window, and there's a hospital opposite that increasingly he can't see. The mist envelops it. And in the novel, the castle lurks in the background. And it's close, but you can't see it because of the heavy mist in the village. So Birds in the Fog isn't a bad description of Kafka's works, arguably. So I'll finish with one just enlarged image of this. So I hope you enjoyed that. And like I say, unfortunately for you, there's plenty more Kafka to come. So all the very best till the next time. Take care.